Have you ever looked around your home and realized you're basically running a museum of abandoned hobbies? There's a ukulele in the corner you haven't touched in months, a stack of unopened watercolors, a home fermentation kit, maybe even a diving certification you forgot you had. If you're autistic, ADHD, or both, you might know this pattern intimately. We sometimes call it the neurodivergent hobby graveyard. And no, while it might seem to reflect laziness or flakiness, it's about managing dopamine. Hi, I'm Essie. I'm an autistic and ADHD therapist, and today I'm going to talk about how many of us manage dopamine dysregulation through activity. Specifically, how each time we find a new interest, it's like discovering a new mountain to climb. We start at the base, full of energy, with a pack full of gear and possibility. Every step, every new piece of information is a dopamine hit that keeps us moving upward until we reach the summit, look around, and start scanning the horizon for a new peak. This cycle of intense interests, deep dives, and sudden abandonment might look confusing from the outside, but for us, it's often the most effective way to stay motivated, stimulated, and emotionally afloat. So let's dive in and unpack what's really going on beneath the surface. ADHD and some autistic brains can struggle with what's known as dopamine dysregulation. This means we don't get that steady, consistent stream of dopamine like neurotypical brains often do. We're not always able to feel that intrinsic reward from daily life or small accomplishments. So what do? We go chasing novelty, challenge, intensity, anything that might deliver that precious neurochemical fix. You may have heard the term dopamine farming or dopamine mining before. And for us, that doesn't mean chasing thrills for fun, but chasing them for regulation, for functionality, for emotional balance. In our brains, dopamine is patchy, unreliable. Sometimes it floods in, other times it dries up completely. That inconsistency makes it really difficult to access motivation, sustain effort, or feel satisfaction from the small wins that seem to fuel others so easily. That's why we don't always feel that internal push to get started, or we lose steam halfway through, or we forget what we were doing mid-task, or we get stuck in boredom so intense it's actually painful. So we hunt. We seek out the spark, that thing that might light up the reward centers in our brain. That's why we can spend 10 hours deep diving into a new passion, but forget to answer an email for 3 weeks. But here's the thing. We don't just stumble into new hobbies or passions by accident. There's a pattern here, a rhythm. And for many of us, that rhythm is about sustaining engagement, keeping the brain fed with just enough stimulation to stay focused, grounded, and alive. And then, suddenly, you start to feel it. The energy dips, the urgency fades. You don't feel as excited to open that course, or pick up that camera, or go to that class. The gear starts gathering dust. Your browser has 43 tabs open, but none of them feel compelling anymore. You've hit the plateau. And for neurodivergent folks, the plateau can feel devastating. But here's what's going on neurologically. That new activity, whether it was a hobby, a job, a topic, a lifestyle change, initially gave you the perfect blend of novelty, challenge, and reward. You were climbing a mountain, getting little dopamine hits along the way. The slope was steep enough to feel exciting, but not so steep that it felt impossible. But at some point, that climb flattens. You're no longer being stimulated because you've learned most of what there is to learn. You've bought all the gear, you've mastered the basics, and now the reward is no longer automatic. You're not growing at the same pace, you're not discovering, you're just maintaining. And if there's one thing our brains do not like, it's maintenance mode. This is a sign of reward deficiency. When the returns decrease, when the challenge drops, or the novelty wears off, or the social connection fades, your brain senses this is no longer worth the effort. That's when the crash begins. You might start avoiding the hobby entirely, feeling guilty for spending so much money on it, wondering why you can't stick with anything. You might even feel like a failure for abandoning something you were so excited about just weeks or months ago. People around you may notice too. They might call you impulsive, non-committal, flaky, inconsistent. But what they're not seeing is that this isn't a character flaw so much as a chemical shift. Your brain is simply no longer being fed in the way it needs. So it starts sending you out, often frantically, searching for the next mountain to climb, the next source, the next hit of engagement that feels like life. So what happens after the crash? Well, now we're standing in the middle of the wreckage. You've got the supplies, the tools, the reading materials, the subscriptions, maybe even a tattoo or a half-finished website, and yet zero interest. Welcome to the Neurodivergent hobby graveyard. For some, it's a literal space, a closet or garage packed with abandoned gear. For others, it's digital, hard drives full of projects, ideas, passions we once chased with our whole hearts. At some point, we cared intensely, we cared enough to invest, to immerse, to identify with a thing. And then one day, poof, the spark disappears, and with it, sometimes, a chunk of our identity. Now, this is where shame can creep in. You might start thinking, why can't I stick with anything? I'm so wasteful. I always do this. I go all in and then I abandon it. Maybe I'm just broken. But I want to say this clearly. This cycle is less failure than strategy. It's your brain trying to regulate itself in a world that rarely meets your needs. You were never meant to pick one thing and stick with it forever. That model of linear progress, narrow specialization, and lifelong consistency is designed for neurotypical reward systems. It's based on the assumption that motivation comes from delayed gratification and internal consistency. For us, motivation often comes from novelty, challenge, and creative friction. We're multi-passionate. We're dopamine farmers. We're climbing many mountains. We like to keep many irons in the fire, not because we're indecisive, but because that's how we stay engaged with life. But yes, it's still hard because these unfinished projects and abandoned hobbies, they cost us something: money, time, emotional investment, and sometimes the perception of stability in other people's eyes. And it's easy to internalize these judgments, especially in a society steeped in ableism, where deviation from the norm is often pathologized or dismissed. But the truth is, your hobby graveyard is not evidence of failure, but of effort, of curiosity, of survival. Every hobby was an attempt to engage with the world in a way that made sense to your brain. And yet, when you live in a world that measures success by how long you can stick with something, it's easy to feel like you're failing every time you walk away. But let me offer a different frame. What if, instead of asking, why can't I stick with anything, we asked, what did this hobby give me at the time I needed it? What problem was it solving, emotionally, neurologically, socially? What did I learn about myself in the process? Because if you can look back, not through the lens of shame, but through the lens of compassion, you'll likely see that each interest or obsession served a purpose. It gave you structure, focus, community, identity, or a break from overwhelm. It gave your brain what it was craving. Sometimes it gave you hope. And just because it's no longer active doesn't mean it was a waste. Many of us are deeply impacted by internalized ableism, that voice that says we're lazy, inconsistent, or broken. That tyrannical inner critic that whispers, you always quit, you never finish anything. But the truth is, this cycle is not a personal failing. Again, it's a neurological strategy. You're adapting to your environment, you're trying to regulate with the tools you have. And when one tool stops working, your brain doesn't just sit there and suffer, it goes looking for the next one. This, as I see it, is a sign of resilience. It's also worth noting the outside world doesn't always understand this pattern. From the outside, we are going to look probably chaotic, disorganized, and impulsive, especially in systems designed to reward linear long-term paths like traditional schooling, corporate jobs, or rigid social structures. But here's the secret most of us weren't told. You don't need permission to be wired differently. You just need understanding, especially from yourself. So how do we work with this pattern instead of against it? Because while we want to honor the way our brains are wired, we also want to reduce the fallout, the financial strain, the burnout, the shame spiral, the clutter, the sense of constant starting and stopping. We don't have to fix this cycle, but we can learn to move through it more intentionally. Let's talk about some strategies that can help. 1. Introduce a waiting period. If you're in that glorious hyperfocus stage where a new interest can feel like the one, it can be helpful to set some rules around investment. For example, I'll wait 1 month before I buy any expensive gear, or I'll limit my initial budget to $50 until I see if this sticks. This is all about protecting future you from regret and overwhelm. Giving yourself a small buffer allows the interest to unfold naturally without front-loading the pressure. 2. Name the phase. Try naming the phase you're in when you're deep in a new interest. You might say, I'm in my info gathering phase. I'm in the honeymoon period of a new hyperfixation. This might be temporary, and that's okay. Naming it helps you stay grounded. It creates a little distance between you and the roller coaster of passion and crash. It also helps reduce the shame if or when the plateau comes, because you've already acknowledged that this might not be forever. 3. Create low-stakes entry points. When possible, try starting a new hobby in a low-cost, flexible way. Instead of buying the most expensive tools right away, see if there are ways to rent, borrow, or try before you buy. For example, use a library app for books before purchasing them. Try free YouTube classes before committing to a full course. Ask in local Neurodivergent or Buy Nothing groups if anyone has gear they're not using. This helps keep the door open without committing your whole wallet to the idea that this might be the one. 4. Curate, don't cling to. It's okay to let go of past interests. It really is. If you've moved on from something, you're allowed to release it. That might mean selling gear, donating supplies, or just giving yourself permission not to feel guilty every time you look at it. If it's hard to let go entirely, consider a maybe box, a container you revisit every few months. If you haven't touched anything inside for a while, that's a signal. And remember, letting go of these items isn't erasing who you were, it's about making space for who you're becoming. 5. Celebrate your gains. Every interest you've had has shaped you. Even if you've walked away from it, you still learned new skills, gained confidence, found language for your passions, built bridges to other interests, connected with others who shared your enthusiasm. Try making a list, not of what you gave up, but of what each hobby gave you. Reclaim the narrative from guilt to gratitude. 6. Anchor your identity. One of the hardest parts of cycling through passions is the identity whiplash. When you're deeply immersed in something, it can feel like that interest is who you are. So when it fades, you might feel lost, like you've lost yourself. But your worth is not in what you do, it's in who you are. You are not only valid when you're hyper-focused, productive, or engaged. You're still valid when you're in a rest phase, or bored, or stuck, or between mountains. So if you have a closet full of abandoned art supplies, or a bookshelf of half-finished obsessions, or a garage that looks like a graveyard of past lives, you're not alone. Know that you are navigating a brain that needs more stimulation, more novelty, more challenge, more depth to stay afloat. And you've been doing your best to meet that need with what you've had. Yes, it can be frustrating. Yes, it can be expensive. Yes, it can be disheartening to love something so intensely, only to watch that love slip away. But every one of those passions has left a mark. Every mountain you climbed, even halfway, taught you something, gave you something, connected you to a part of yourself that maybe had been dormant for a while. You're not just chasing dopamine, you're chasing aliveness. And there's nothing shameful about that. I want to hear from you. What's in your hobby graveyard? What mountains have you climbed and left behind? And what did they give you while you were there? Have you found any strategies that help you manage your passions without burning out or going broke? Drop it all in the comments. Let's normalize this experience and take the shame out of being multi-passionate, of needing novelty, of being wired differently. And if this resonated with you, if you felt seen by what I shared, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.